Thank you, Mr. Dillingham. Commissioner Gora?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address my first couple of questions to Inspector General Fine. First of all, I'd like to say we have a very able and talented public servant in Glenn Fine, and we're very happy to have you here today and very pleased that you are doing your job at the Justice Department. First question. I understand that the CIA launched an internal review immediately after 9/11 of its conduct before 9/11. Did the Justice Department do the same thing?
No, the Justice Department did not do a broad after-action report similar to what you've described at the CIA. Initially, the Justice Department deferred to the Joint Intelligence Committee, which was doing a broad review that looked at the actions of various federal government agencies, including the Justice Department and others. After that, it is deferred to this commission to do that broad review. However, the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Justice, my office, has done a series of reviews on national security issues, some of which I've described in the report, in my written testimony, others on the FBI. In addition, when we have been confronted with particular issues, such as the Ada and al-Shahi visa issue, or change of application issue, we've done reviews on that. And in June, as I mentioned, of last year, at the request of Director Mueller, we have launched a review of how the FBI handled intelligence information related to the September 11th attack. So we are doing that kind of review, but the broad after-action review, similar to the CIA, has not been undertaken by the Justice Department itself.
Thank you. My second question is this. As I read your report, I see very different reviews occurring for a foreigner who wants to come into this country as a student, depending on what route he takes. So could you contrast, for example, a foreigner who wants to come into this country as a student, but who applies for a visa in a visa waiver country, comes in as a visitor, and then tries to change his status to a student status, which would allow him to stay longer, versus someone who applies to be a student from a non-waiver country and goes through the consular process for a student waiver. Could you describe the two?
Sure. It is a different review process. For the student who applies abroad in his or her own country, they have to show ties to the country, their own country, so that they indication that they will return to the country afterwards. They have to show financial means. They have to show they've been accepted at an accredited school in the United States. And normally, although not always, but normally they go through an interview process with the consular officer. And as a result, they get a student visa. They come to the United States. They present the visa to the immigration inspector at the port of entry, and they enter into the United States and take up studies. That's a different process than foreign students who do not get the visa abroad, but who come to the United States on a visitor visa, or who may come to the United States without a visa because they're from one of the 28 visa waiver countries. So they enter the United States either with a visitor visa or without the visa from a visa waiver country, and in the United States they then apply to change their status to student. In the United States, it's largely a paper process. They file the form, the I-589 form. They show they've been accepted by a school. They show financial means. And then the INS adjudicates their status on paper without an interview, and also prior to September 11th, as we found in the Ada and al-Shahi case, without even checks of the databases that would show what their status was when they applied to the United States. So it is a different process depending on which route they take.
So if you're clever, you can figure out a way to come into this country and stay for a substantial period of time without anyone ever interviewing you as to the appropriateness of that occurring.
It's possible. It is possible to do that.
And has that changed since September 11th?
It has not markedly changed since September 11th, particularly from the visa waiver countries.
Mr. Dillingham, did you want to add something?
Yes, I did. To to the best of our knowledge, the State Department is denying student visas to people who want to come in to study flying in the United States. That, in fact, has changed.
I'm glad to hear that. One other general question for you, Mr. Fine. What is the state of connectivity between the intelligence community and INS today? INS either at the Justice Department or at the Department of Homeland Security. How much information flows between the intelligence community and those who are guarding our borders and vice versa?
Connectivity is better than it was in the past. Now, immigration inspectors and INS officials do connect through their own databases, through the Interagency Border Information System, to State Department databases, the CLASS database, tip-off systems, and in those databases is intelligence information provided by intelligence agencies. In addition, the INS has more direct contacts with the intelligence agencies through their Office of Intelligence. However, the information is often unclassified, often sometimes vague, and not in a particularly usable form, we've been told by some immigration inspectors. I think that's a critical issue that this commission and the government needs to look at. The connectivity of information, the integration of the systems, and the ability to get usable information, usable intelligence information to the frontline employees who need to use that information to screen people who come to the United States. Without that, it's an enormously difficult job that they do.
Thank you for that answer.
Commissioner Gordon?
Mr. Fine, assuming that in 2001, the INS had been substantially better funded, maybe twice as much money, and equally more efficient in carrying out its duties, how many of the 19 hijackers could have been in the United States or would have had a first entry into the United States perfectly validly in any event?
That actually, I think, is speculative, and I can't really answer that question. What we do know is many of them, most of them, entered into the United States with valid visas, and that the immigration inspectors did not have any information or intelligence that would have changed the outcome of their inspection of them. So for that, it's hard to say what the difference would have been had the INS been better funded or had more information. But I do think it's an important issue that needs to be addressed going forward.
Well, I take it then that most, if not all of them, could have at least had a first entry into the United States as visitors, even if INS had been much more efficient.
That's correct. And really the issue there is the State Department and the State Department's interviews of them, giving visas to them. And my understanding is...
But they wouldn't have required interviews at all if they were just coming here as tourists, would they?
Pardon me?
Would they have not required interviews at all if they were just coming here first as tourists?
From some countries they would have, yes. From the visa waiver countries, they wouldn't have required interviews, but many of them came from non-visa waiver countries such as Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, where they did require interviews. And the Inspector General at the Department of State has looked at that, and from my understanding of it, has indicated that there were some gaps in the processing of those 19 tourists for their visas. But that's an issue for the State Department's Inspector General.
The question is basically a lead-in to this, is I think you've pointed out very eloquently, particularly in your written statement, the INS or any similar agency doesn't exist simply to keep people out. It exists in order to let the right people in, whether they're tourists or full-time immigrants or are doing business here or, or anything else. And one of your statistics is 500 million particular contacts at one time or another. So I guess my question is, how much can we realistically expect to increase safety and the exclusion of dangerous aliens simply by a more efficient bureaucracy or Homeland Security agency, and how much in providing for the safety of the people of the United States is on the laps of Congress, perhaps to make different policies and to make the system less complex and easier to administer than it is. Have you, does the Department of Justice have views on that subject?
Well, I'm not sure I can speak for the Department of Justice per se, but I do believe that the issues need to be addressed at all levels. It can't simply be looking at the INS and the end product of the process and say all the onus or burden goes upon them. There does have to be a look at how to allow the flow of travelers and commerce across our borders, but in a way that attempts to screen out ones who shouldn't be here, perhaps through trusted traveler lanes or ways to increase the ability of cargo to be inspected in advance. So that is an important issue that are policy issues that the United States Congress has to look at as well. What we've looked at is the INS's aspect of it, and we have found deficiencies. I'm not saying that that's the sole problem in protecting our country.
One more question of that nature. You spoke of the 28 visa waiver countries, and in your written testimony, at least, you speak to the fact that there is a great deal of theft of passports from those countries. And of course, those are, in a sense, valid passports. Is there any practical solution to that problem? Obviously, from very friendly countries, a visa waiver is probably a good policy decision. But how do we prevent the misuse of visa waiver passports?
I think there are several ways to do that. One is to ensure that those countries have better accountability of their passports. And if their passports are being stolen, we might want to look to see whether those countries should remain in the visa waiver program. Secondly, once those passports are stolen, they have to be reported so that the numbers of those passports can be entered into lookout systems, and when someone traveling with that passport shows up at a port of entry, an INS inspector can check the database, see that it's a stolen passport, see that it's illegitimate, and stop that person. What we found in our reviews is that foreign countries sometimes...
How are we going to determine whether the passport was stolen?
By the foreign country having clear internal controls about the passports. They know they're missing, they know they're stolen, they report it to the United States, it's entered into a lookout system, and then we can stop the people who try and use those passports. And that's what happens, but we found that it's not happening on a consistent basis, and in some cases, the INS inspectors didn't even check the lookout systems to determine whether the passport had been reported as stolen. That's one thing that we can do.
Okay. Jamie,
Let me follow up on that and then move to some questions of Mr. Woldsky and Mr. Dillingham. The INS, as I understand it from your reports and from my own experience, has utilized biometric measures for the identification of individuals trying to come into this country, which obviously are harder to forge than a passport and certainly harder to steal. Do you see a future in the utilization more broadly of biometric measures as a form of identity checks at our borders?
Yes, I do. I think it's critical. Names can be changed, names can be misspelled, names are not a full enough identifier, and there does need to be some use of the biometric to ensure that the person who is showing up at the border is the person who received the visa, and also that the person is who he or she says he is. So yes, biometrics are clearly needed to be incorporated into our identification systems.
And finally, you have raised some, I think, serious questions about the visa waiver program. In your professional opinion, should that program be continued?
I think the visa waiver program does have significant benefits. It is a policy question whether those benefits outweigh the costs. And I am not in a posture to say that the program should be discontinued, but I do think that the countries who are in it should be carefully screened and held accountable to ensure that there are appropriate measures that its passports are not being fraudulently used.
Have we picked up a suspected terrorist who came here on a stolen passport from a visa waiver country?
Yes, we have.
I'd like to ask Mr. Dillingham a couple of questions, not just about aviation security, but as I understand it, you previously were director of physical infrastructure issues generally at the GAO. There have been published reports that the Transportation Security Administration has poured, in fact, more resources into aviation security than perhaps we are needing at the moment, and yet we hear that there is not the same degree of attention being paid to our ports, to container shipments, to bridges, to tunnels, and as you have said, if everyone is in charge, no one is in charge. And you have contrasted the way in which TSA is approaching its role in aviation security with what I think you described as a more management role, setting standards and creating a collaborative role with all of the many parties who have responsibilities for all of these other transportation modes. Could you comment on whether the resources are adequate to maintain and increase our security in these other areas of transportation, and whether the management structure that you have described is adequate?
Yes, I think without a doubt there has been disproportionate resources applied to aviation. And aviation is different from the rest of the modes in that there was a large federal presence associated with aviation prior to 9/11. It was of course, the FAA. And the other modes are also different in their characteristics. Mass transit, for example, is very hard to secure because the nature of it, it's large, it has to be open, there's just lots of ways to get into it. Ports. Huge undertaking, needs to be done, but there's also this sort of mix of stakeholders, local, state, and federal players with regard to some of these other modes of transportation. Clearly, there is a gap between what has been done for aviation and what needs to be done for the rest of the modes. Money is a big issue. Just by example, we came up from Washington on the Amtrak. We came through a very heavily populated Northeast corridor, and to my knowledge, there was no metal detector check, there was no screening to speak of, and we pulled in under Penn Station. That could have been a very bad situation. A situation that occurred in Baltimore a year or so ago with a chemical fire on a freight train. All of this points to the notion that there are definite gaps. Whether there are going to be enough resources to address that is a real question. What the TSA is doing now is trying to establish what are the vulnerabilities associated with these various modes and to move from there. The management structure you ask about, I think there's no way that it can be the same as with aviation. Aviation was mandated by legislation, so that I think the coordination and the collaboration and the structure that TSA is trying to put in place is in fact a good first step, and it is probably a logical step to take in terms of managing. It will still be a case where it won't be a case where nobody's in charge. TSA will be in charge by statute. They're in charge of all transportation security, and they will therefore have a statutory basis to coordinate and for cooperation in setting standards across the system.
Well, Mr. Dillingham, if I might make an observation, before September 11th, 2001, the GAO and other agencies made numerous reports about the vulnerability of our aviation security system. And the response was often you need to understand how dispersed power is. There are various entities with various responsibilities. There are local transportation authorities. There's the aviation industry, et cetera. And of course, this is very costly, and trying to figure out who bears the burden is very complicated. That sounds actually quite similar to what we're hearing now about transportation outside the aviation security arena. I'm prepared to concede that there is a lot of complexity, but I wonder whether we have the same urgency being brought to bear around our ports in particular, around container shipments in particular, around the security of our bridges and tunnels, and whether you, having broad experience and lengthy experience in this area, feel that we have the right level of effort and the right structure being brought to bear.
I think the process that's in place is the necessary process. That is to determine what's important. This is all being done on a risk assessment basis, meaning that TSA is looking across all modes, trying to see what the vulnerabilities and the threats are, and then to prioritize that across all threats and across all modes. Because as I said in my statement, there's no way that we as a country can secure against all risk. So we have to prioritize, and we have to prioritize according to what the threat is and the likely harm that would come if that threat is in fact realized. I think ports are high on the agenda. Right now, only 2% of the thousands of containers that come into the country are physically inspected. But neither the technology nor the manpower is available to inspect 100% of them. But we're moving in the direction of getting better technologies and finding ways both internationally and domestically to address the issue.
Thank you. And do you want to go ahead, jump in here?
Mr. Dillingham, you were very optimistic about the degree of progress we've made since 9/11 with respect to air transportation. First, I just wanted to make sure you talked about 6 modes. Have I got the other 5 right? Car, train, mass transit, bus, and maritime?
Yes, sir.
Would those be the other 5? Which of those 5 is the highest priority and the greatest threat as far as you're concerned from the point of view of moving in the direction of the degree of progress we've made with airlines?
I think ports. I think maritime, because maritime can not only be a place of substantial infrastructure damage, but it can have cascading effects on the economy. I mean, we can see when our ports were closed for a very short time a few months ago, how that affected the economy, international commerce. So I think ports is probably the next highest priority and probably highest in terms of vulnerability as well.
One other question, if I may, back to air transportation for both you and for Mr. Fine. How would you characterize the cooperation of the commercial airlines themselves in connection with air transportation safety? That's the question for you. And the question for you, Mr. Fine, with respect to tracking immigrants and immigrants from the United States.
When you say their cooperation with regard to safety, could you say more? What do you mean?
Well, the whole TSA attempt, which you have characterized as being pretty successful so far, would you characterize all or most of the airlines as being highly cooperative with these safety measures or reluctant from time to time?
I think the airlines are, it's probably both. The airlines, of course, are in some economic distress. And so the airlines will often sort of push back with regard to at least paying for some of the security measures that are being put in place, and they see them as unfunded mandates. However, the airlines, on the other hand, recognize that if the flying public does not believe that security is much improved, the flying public will not come back, and the airline industry will suffer even greater economic woes, which in turn has a cascading effect on the rest of the economy.
How about with tracking people, Mr. Fine?
I think it's mixed. I don't think they've been uncooperative. I do think that there are issues with regarding the collection of departure cards, I-94, and whether they're universally collected and provided to the INS. They're clearly not. There are also issues with regard to airport facilities, inspection facilities, ensuring that they are safe and secure. In the end, though, it's an INS, it's a government function to ensure that it is handled appropriately. And so I think the onus is on the federal government to ensure that whatever needs to be done is done. And I think that's where the answer lies.
Okay, Jamie?
Mr. Woldsky, we had a witness here yesterday who basically said that there is so much money, as he put it, I think, sloshing around in the Islamic charitable community, and so relatively little of it is needed, if you will, to successfully fund terrorism, that the ability to squeeze out the part that is being siphoned off into the support of terrorism activities is extremely challenging, let's say. Could you give us your assessment of that? After all, you have said we need to do that. We need to identify those sources of funds and eliminate them.
Sure. Well, first, I absolutely think it's true that there is a very large amount of money that, as you said, or the witness said, sloshes around through that system, in part because it is actually one of the 5 pillars of Islam, zakat, to give at least 2.5% of your income to charitable endeavors. That is collected both through retail charities, at mosques and Muslim community centers, and through larger donations, typically by Gulf Arabs, but particularly when it's given at mosques and Muslim community centers, again, like the mosque across the river, it's frequently collected by a community leader. It is commingled. It is dispersed in the discretion of the community leader, most frequently without any record keeping or any accountability. But I don't agree with the premise that just because a large amount of money moves through that system, that the United States should not take steps to regulate that activity within its own borders, nor do I agree with the premise that the United States should forego instruments of foreign policy to compel other states in which this activity occurs to engage in similar regulatory efforts. I think that there are really 2 reasons to take such action, notwithstanding the fact that a relatively small amount of money can contribute to devastating terrorist attacks. The first is that where particular nodes are identified, you actually can take steps to prevent attacks from occurring by choking off the financing. And secondly, to the extent that you force systemic changes, you make it harder for terrorists to raise and move money. And to the extent that you achieve that objective, you are forcing them to spend more time worrying about how they're going to raise and move money than spending time and effort on planning and executing deadly attacks.
Thank you for that response, and I think it will help us as we consider the kind of factual inquiry we need to be making here. You raise, I think, 2 fairly dispiriting points. One is that the issue of attacking the sources of terrorism funding has moved lower on the bilateral foreign policy agenda, and also that the necessity for some international rubric for attacking terrorist financing is has been undermined by the lack of international consensus for this effort. And I was struck by the fact that in November of '02, when you did your report, you actually observed that while immediately in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a lot of international cooperation, you said that coalition may be fraying, and you noted a, quote, widening gap between the U.S. and Europe on the basic salience and parameters of global terrorism. And my question to you is this. Here we are 6 months later. How are our requests for international cooperation in the area of financing of terrorism being met? And how are other key participants in the international community currently responding to our requests for help?
I think that with respect to both questions, unfortunately, they're better posed to someone who is currently working on these issues on behalf of the United States government. But I do think that, as a general matter, there is substantial evidence to suggest that our foreign partners, you have to remember, the way this process has worked insofar as IEPA designations is concerned, is that the United States, through executive order, has named individuals and organizations that are part of the terrorist financial network, the assets of which are frozen, assets subject to U.S. jurisdiction are frozen, and U.S. persons are prohibited by law from transacting business with those persons or organizations. That process has been multilateralized through UN Security Council Resolution 1390, whereby the same names of individuals and organizations has gone to the United Nations and gone out to the member states of the United Nations for similar action, as the member states may wish to engage in. There have been, in my experience, two problems with the multilateralization of that process. The first is that many states lack the technical capacity to actually freeze funds. And that was illustrated for me personally when I visited in recent months a strategically significant African country. And I asked them the question, what happened to this piece of paper with all these names that came from the United Nations? Where did it go? Answer, it went to the foreign ministry. Go to the foreign ministry and say, okay, well, what did you do with this piece of paper with all the names on it? Well, we sent it to the central bank. Go to the central bank, as I did. Say, what happened to this list? Well, we sent it to our banks. You go to the banks, as I did. What happened to this piece of paper with all the names? Well, we put it over there because we don't have any ability to go through our accounts and identify the beneficial holders of the accounts. So that is a point on technical capacity, which needs to be addressed in this context. The second point has to do with differing standards of who and what constitutes a terrorist, and also evidentiary standards with respect to the type of information that foreign states have asked for in connection with supporting the U.S. designations. With respect to the first subpoint, as the report of the Council on Foreign Relations notes, the European Union still to this day permits Hamas and Hezbollah to legally raise funds on its territory. Secondly, with respect to evidentiary standards, what we have found post 9/11 is that while there was an initial willingness of other states to freeze funds of designated individuals and organizations originated by the U.S. government, that willingness faded as the months went on, and foreign states asked for increasingly sensitive intelligence information that supported the original U.S. designations, which, when it wasn't provided, caused them to fail to take steps to freeze the accounts of designated individuals and organizations.
Mr. Woldsky, would you give us a brief description of how the Hawala system works? You know, what kind of financial system is it? And secondly, what the United States has done with respect to its illegitimate use for the support of terrorism when the deposits originate here in the United States. And third, whether there's really anything we can do with respect to such an informal system when the transactions take place entirely overseas.
Sure. The way it works is essentially as follows. Let's assume that I am a Pakistani immigrant living in Brooklyn, and I wish to transfer of $500 to my parents living in Islamabad. The way I can use the Hawala system to accomplish that money transfer is by going to a local individual, a Hawaladar, in Brooklyn, giving him my $500. He uses his network, which is most frequently a clan or family-based network, and contacts his counterpart in Islamabad, and he says, when someone comes in with a particular identifying code, give him the $500. That system enables money to be moved without the physical movement of money.
Is not that individual in Brooklyn engaged in banking activities under the laws of New York?
Well, until recently, the problem has been that there's been no federal regulation of that activity. Post 9/11, using pre-existing legal authorities, the Department of the Treasury has begun to require that activity, individuals who engage in that activity, to register. And because the activity fundamentally is intended to be anonymous, without record keeping, without paper trails, the likelihood that these individuals will register is actually quite remote. But notwithstanding that fact, it provides a basis for prosecution in federal court if they fail to register. The problem prior to 9/11 is that frequently there was no basis for prosecution in federal court. Now, if they fail to register, they can be prosecuted.
And is that effectively our method of stopping some portion of that $500 from going not to the parent in Islamabad, but to terrorism?
Yes. I mean, I think that a basic point which you alluded to is that this system of moving money is used for many legitimate purposes. It's unique to several different cultures in South Asia and East Asia. It's been used for centuries, and it is used by terrorists and other criminals, but it's also used by a lot of people who just want to move money and avoid formal banking. They don't have access to the financial internet, to the formal financial system, or they want to avoid it for whatever reasons. But you asked whether that was the primary method of regulating this activity in the United States. I believe that it is through a registration system. And you also asked whether what steps or whether the United States should take action to prevent other countries from being part of abuses of this system. And I think that the answer is yes. Again, if you look under Title III of the USA Patriot Act, it authorizes the executive branch to restrict or prohibit access to the U.S. financial system on the part of states or foreign financial institutions that lack adequate anti-money laundering regimes. This is ultimately the most powerful tool in the arsenal of the U.S. government. It has not, and it provides leverage over states that, for instance, refuse to regulate in any manner the Hawala system. It hasn't really been used to this point in this context, and the findings of the distinguished bipartisan commission of the Council on Foreign Relations was that it should.
One follow-up question. You may have left out the middle of this transaction. Your Pakistani has gone and given $500 to the Hawala person in Brooklyn, who has then called Islamabad or communicated with Islamabad, which gives $500 to the parent there. But somehow or other, the $500 has still got to get from Brooklyn to Islamabad, does it not?
No, it doesn't.
Well,
that's how the system works. In other words, it is credited through a family relationship, let's say, or a clan-based relationship. The money itself physically does not move. If you, for instance, if your uncle called you and asked you to loan some $500 to someone who he wanted you to loan the money to, you probably would do it, even if he didn't advance you the $500, and you would rely on the fact of your family relationship for settlement to occur in a manner of your choosing at some future date. And that's exactly how the Hawala system works.
There would be an offsetting transaction at some point in the future.
At some point in the future, again, at a time of convenience, whatever the circumstances may require, it doesn't have to be in cash. It could be in gold. It could be through some commingled account in an Islamic bank. It can occur in a variety of different ways.
One of the challenges for this commission is to look at organizational issues and to make sure, A, our government is arrayed correctly and organized correctly, and B, that it is using all of its authorities. The Council on Foreign Relations report and your testimony note a lack of organizational accountability for the money laundering issue. And you made a number of recommendations with regard to who should have the leadership and who should have the ultimate responsibility. Since that report was issued, can you describe what, if anything, has been done to address the organizational problems that you identified, and could you describe briefly those organizational deficiencies?
Sure. The report suggested that, notwithstanding the significance of this issue, the fundamental significance of this issue, there was no single U.S. official with the correct mandate and authority to coordinate U.S. policy on terrorist financing issues. Policy is currently coordinated through a policy coordination committee that is headed by the General Counsel of the Treasury Department. And the bipartisan commission of the Council on Foreign Relations concluded that, for a variety of reasons, was not the most effective way to coordinate the various diplomatic, intelligence, law enforcement, and regulatory ingredients that contribute to an effective and sustained U.S. policy response. For one thing, the report of the Council on Foreign Relations concluded that the Treasury Department was not the appropriate agency to coordinate diplomatic or intelligence activities. Now, there's also a question as to whether or not even the most capable General Counsel of the Treasury, and I don't know the General Counsel of the Treasury, but I'm told that he is extraordinarily competent, given his other statutory and institutional responsibilities, has other things to worry about than the suppression of terrorist financing.
I take it from your report, though, that the Congress has vested this responsibility in the Treasury Department, and other agencies of government have resisted implementing that. Is that correct?
Well, I think that the executive branch has vested this responsibility in the Treasury Department. There's no statutory authority whatsoever with respect to terrorist financing. Our report concluded that because of the very different and difficult ingredients that contribute to an effective response, ranging from diplomatic activities to intelligence activities to regulatory activities, that was best coordinated out of the White House.
A question, an organizational question for you, Mr. Fine. You have noted that a very substantial portion of the Immigration and Naturalization Service responsibilities that are the subject of your reports have now been transferred to the Department of Homeland Security. Your office has evidently built up a tremendous amount of expertise in the review and oversight of those functions. Has all of that capacity in your office been transferred to the Department of Homeland Security so that that oversight can continue, excuse me, uninterrupted in that new department?
All of our capacity has not been transferred, but we have transferred a portion of our capacity. There is a Department of Homeland Security Office of the Inspector General that has been created. It's been created with resources from various entities. We've provided resources to it. The Department of Treasury Inspector General's Office has provided resources. The Department of Transportation Inspector General's Office has provided resources, FEMA and others. So there is a newly developed Department of Homeland Security OIG. We've provided investigators and some managers to that entity. A lot of our capacity is involved with the INS, but it's also involved with the FBI, the DEA, the Marshal Service, so it's not a distinct unit that we could transfer over there. I do think it is a critical issue that you raised, though, because I do think it is critically important that there be adequate, aggressive, and strong oversight over this new entity, ranging from the INS to the Customs Service to the Secret Service to the TSA, and it is going to be a daunting challenge for that new agency, the Department of Homeland Security, OIG, to get up and running and to ensure that there is continuity of oversight. We believe strongly in it, and we think that that new OIG ought to be adequately funded to perform its mission in an aggressive way.
Mr. Woldsky, well, first of all, let me say this has been a marvelous panel. Each of the three of you have been very helpful to the commission, and we appreciate it. Mr. Woldsky, I was focused on your final paragraph. We don't hold the Saudis' feet to the fire. Now, I gather from your testimony that we, the United States, and the countries that are most responsible here, if we had the political will to crack down on financing, we could do it. But because of policy considerations that are very important, we don't do it. We have to have the oil. We have to have the overflight rights. We have to have the basing rights. And because we have to have those things, we do not hold their feet to the fire. Is that your view?
That is my view. Fortunately, I wasn't called before you to testify on policy with regard to Saudi Arabia in the current context of
No, I appreciate that. I'm not being critical of you in any way. It's just a very good illustration of how policy gets in the way of, in this case, enforcement.
Yes, that's the point of my testimony.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm not here to make judgments over whether or not particular issues should be prioritized over other issuut
I understand.
But what I can tell you is that the United States at the highest levels has not spoken out loudly and forcefully on the terrorist financing issue as it relates to Saudi Arabia. Now, that's not to say that things aren't being done. I have every reason to believe that a lot is being done, but it's being done in the shadows. And the conclusion of the Council on Foreign Relations report was that it was time to bring it out of the shadows, for the President of the United States or for other senior officials to state clearly, unequivocally, and unambiguously what was required of the Saudi government on the terrorist financing issue. That is not being done. And in the judgment of this task force, it needed to be done in order to set benchmarks for the Saudis and to communicate, to enable the Saudi government to communicate to its own citizens what type of conduct was and was not acceptable.
Mr. Dillingham, I don't want to sound like a cranky business traveler, but I'd like to get into an area of focus on the part of TSA in terms of air travel security, because funding follows focus, as we know. And your testimony and that of Mr. Fine this morning have pointed out some rather large funding gaps, particularly with regard to port security, which you testified to, and which and the issue of border security that Mr. Fine testified to. I acknowledge that TSA employees, the new ones especially, are finding and retrieving large amounts of weapons, but if news stories are to be credited, some weapons still get through. I understand it's a system which depends not just on technology, but on human instinct and human paying attention as well. But it seems to me that sometimes a fault of government is that it fights yesterday's battles. As I go through airline security screening processes, I see this sort of almost obsessive focus on belts and shoes. And at the same time, you're telling me that containers are coming into the United States inspected only at the level of 2%, if that. And Mr. Fine is telling me that the northern border is in many respects an unprotected border, particularly with regard to 24/7 coverage, while everybody is down in the Southwest trying to prevent undocumented workers from crossing the border to work in the United States and take jobs that Americans won't do. Is our focus on airline security wrong? Who makes these policies? Who reviews these policies? How are they kept up to date? Are we anticipating ways in which terrorists can use airline vulnerability? Or are we saying because Richard Reed got on an airplane and tried to light his shoes, we're going to focus on shoes of millions and millions of American business travelers? And for the life of me, maybe you can explain it, but I don't see the relevance of showing your belt buckle open as opposed to your belt buckle closed. And yet we have these jam-ups at the security system screening depots with people milling around, wanding people and going all through. We've all seen this process. Is this the right balance? And is there somebody sitting in Washington to say, well, let's look at what we're doing about airline security and try and anticipate future attacks?
Yes, Governor, if I could. I think it's part of, if you've only got a hammer, all the answers you use that hammer for, and that's sort of how aviation security has evolved, in that was the first thing that came out of the box, and we've applied all of our resources to it. It may seem, if I can give you just sort of the story behind the belt buckle, what has been determined is that before 9/11, people would, the belt buckle would send off an alarm, and the screener would pass by and say, okay, belt buckle, no problem. But in the process of testing the system, if you have a belt buckle and you can hide a weapon inside or behind that belt buckle, and it's only passed as, it's only a buckle, it's not a weapon. And that's the kind of situation that they were focusing on. It's the same thing with people at airports. They see grandmothers and children being examined, and it seems embarrassing, and in fact it can be, but they also have intelligence to say that the terrorists have used these kinds of ways to get things through. We are now seeing a ratcheting back of the things that don't make sense. We're seeing a rationalization of security. You no longer ask, did you pack your bag? Has it been with you the whole time? There's no longer the prohibition against, driving up to the airport. So we're seeing a ratcheting back. We're seeing a rationalization of it. So there is someone who's looking at this. After 9/11, it was, let's do everything that we can to change the situation for aviation security. And now there are changes, and you're right. That's been the reputation of security in the country, is fighting the last battle and not looking for what's coming. I can tell you that our office is looking at that issue and trying to understand, to what extent are we looking for the next generation of technologies? To what extent are we moving beyond where we were and being prepared for threats that we haven't seen yet, but that we know are out there?
Mr. Fine, going back to the students for a moment, do we have any rough idea of how many foreign students are in the United States at any one particular time?
About 500,000.
500,000? Mm-hmm. And I noticed all through your written testimony and a little bit in your oral testimony as well that that almost every system that we've developed or identified to deal with some of the issues about student entry or student remainder, student registration, don't yet seem to be working or up to snuff. I mean, is the sheer number of foreign students in the United States at any one time going to overwhelm any system?
It clearly overwhelmed the paper-based system, which was antiquated and inefficient. A computer-based system, I'm not sure it will overwhelm the ability of the system to track who's in the country, who's not in the country, who has shown up at school, who has gotten a student visa, came to the United States, and didn't ever show up in a school, as actually one of the September 11th hijackers did. Got a visa to show up at a language school, never showed up. The school didn't do anything about it, and none of the authorities knew this. So we need a system that tracks that and can provide that information. What's going to be very difficult is what to do with that information and how to decide what are the important ones to follow through with, and how to prioritize what happens with an enormous amount of information. And for that, I think there needs to be intelligence and adequate intelligence to determine where the threats are. But in the first step, there does have to be a system, a computerized system, that does track the status of the students. And I believe that the SEVIS system that is being implemented is a good system and has the potential to do it. It's just simply not fully implemented and needs more steps to go.
Assuming the systems work, can we ever hire enough people to follow up on the information in the systems and go track these folks down who sort of disappear from the system? I mean, to me, that's a really devilish problem.
I don't think you can hire enough people to track all of them, but I think you can do some efforts with some issues where there's intelligence that indicates you need to. It is also important to be able to provide the information from that system to other law enforcement agencies, so that when other law enforcement agencies come in contact with somebody, they will know that this is a person out of status, this is a student who never showed up at school, so that they have that information and can act upon it. Prior to this computerized system, there was no possibility of that.
Could you or Mr. Dillingham comment on the status of the technology or efforts, pilot programs, or anything else that's out there to pre-screen business travelers on airlines, or pre-screen workers who come in to the United States during the course of the day and then go back to their host country in the evening? It seems to me that we haven't made much progress there, and the result is, I presume, that we're still using a lot of human resources to screen the same people day in, day out that present what you'll presume to be a low security risk, and we don't have enough people to guard our northern border.
Those are important projects. There are some projects that provide trusted travelers across the border. They're not universally available. I believe that's an issue that needs to be addressed and needs to be more widely used. Part of the issue is the money. Sometimes the fees are higher than people want to pay. But it is a program that I think provides some relief from the crushing workload that inspectors have along the border, and an ability to speed some people and allow greater scrutiny of others. So I think that's important.
The technology is there, I presume.
Yes.
Yes, following what Mr. Fine said, the TSA is in fact looking at programs such as Trusted Travelers, starting with identifying, using an identification with biometrics for all transportation workers. So that is in process. And at an international level, I think it is one of the unresolved issues. There is some cooperation between other countries and the United States in terms of supplying passenger lists for international travels ahead of time. But that is one of the issues that needs to be further explored, bilateral, multilateral agreements with regard to security and security operations between the United States and other countries. It is clearly an open area.
I've got one question, and then Commissioner Benvenisti and Commissioner Lehman. I guess I read about almost a year ago, for the first time, that the greatest danger out there was probably containers and the container ports. You said basically the same thing again today, and I've read it a number of times in between. You said, well, the technology's got to be developed. Can you give us any kind of an approximate timetable when that kind of danger is going to be lessened, or are we just going to live with it?
We are certainly going to live with it for a while. There is a technology out there there are some technologies that can be used. What's missing right now is better technology, and also the balance between screening and moving cargo. I mean, you know, there are ways in which you can X-ray these containers. You can physically inspect these containers. But what you're talking about is slowing the commercial process. That's where the balance has to be struck. And technologies are, in fact, being developed. In some cases, the technology is so expensive at this point that it's also not being readily accepted by, the maritime community.
But is there any kind of a timetable, any kind of a 6 months, a year, 2 years?
I'd go with multiple years, not 6 months, not a year, a few years.
Okay, Commissioner Benveniste.
What do other countries do on that point,
excuse
to
me.
follow up the chairman's question?
He's got a follow-up question, Commissioner.
They're pretty much in the same way. I mean, those are the containers that are coming here. I mean, what we have now is we are trying to work with other countries to do some screening, some random screening of containers at their point of origin, so there's less to be concerned about as they arrive on U.S. shores. But it's an international issue. It is an international issue. So they aren't doing any more than we're doing. You will find, for example, in an aviation context, El Al does a lot more with containers that are going on board and cargo that's going on board than the U.S. does. But the thing about that is that it's such a small operation compared to what we do in the States that it's not even comparable almost.
Commissioner Benveniste.
Thank you. Mr. Fine, I want to express our appreciation for your offer of complete cooperation with this commission. We will definitely take you up on it. In the limited time that we have available, it is imperative that we take advantage of the pre-existing work that has been done in order to identify what needs to be done further and to make recommendations to the Congress and the President. I want to mention yesterday, Mr. Woldsky, that we had a panel that included Professor Ransdorf and Brian Jenkins, who spoke about the galvanizing effect of 9/11 on the cooperation of international intelligence agencies with our own in connection with the anti-terrorism efforts. You have made a very provocative statement with respect to the potential for degrading that cooperative effort as the result of political differences relating to the war in Iraq. Do you have any concrete evidence or information to suggest that the multilateral intelligence services have in any way slacked off from their cooperation with our intelligence community in that respect?
No, I don't. But I can tell you that having worked these issues day in, day out, they are very difficult under the best of circumstances. And what I fear is that we may be entering into the worst of circumstances with respect to our efforts to cooperate with states that disagree with U.S. policies in Iraq, which I happen to support. But my point is that it may be increasingly difficult for moderate Arab regimes and even our traditional allies to continue to engage in the type of cooperation that I agree was unprecedented following September 11th.
So your observation is one based on informed speculation rather than actual evidence?
Correct.
Let me ask just one other question of Mr. Fine and Mr. Dillingham. We have heard about the potential for the trusted traveler card perhaps utilizing biometric information. Is this the precursor? Is this the camel's nose under the tent for a national identity card utilizing such information?
I don't believe it's the camel under the tent. It is an option for people to undertake if they want to go quickly across the border. So it is a voluntary thing that people can participate in or not participate in if they want to. And I think there's clear benefits to it, to them, and to the system to allow certain people who have been pre-screened to go across the border quickly.
I would agree that I wouldn't say that it's the nose under the tent, but I would want to point out that as far as transportation is concerned, this does not mean that passengers or persons would not be subject to screening. They would still go through a screening process. It means that they would not necessarily have that second screening at the gate. And again, I agree that it is a voluntary process. Right now, transportation is developing what's called a computer-assisted passenger profiling system, CAPS, which is based on information about the passenger that allows them to be sort of placed in various categories of screening, almost like our national terrorist alert sort of thing, red, green, yellow, in terms of degree of screening. And at the end of that flight, that information is purged and it's not kept. There's clearly civil liberties and privacy issues and organizations looking at that. So, and we think that it is a way to make our system more efficient and focus our resources on those places where they need to be focused, since there's finite resources for security.
Okay, we've got to move on, but Commissioner Lehman and Commissioner Fielding and Commissioner Romer have all suggested that they'd like to ask brief questions, I hope.
I have two brief questions for Dr. Dillingham. First, while little old ladies are being frisked at LaGuardia, it is possible for an Arab businessman to pick up the phone and make a call and go up to White Plains and charter a Gulfstream or a 737 Boeing executive jet, which has no reinforced doors, no armed pilots, and no screening for he and his party to go through. Are there any plans to do anything about this rather huge lacuna in our civil aviation security?
Yes, Mr. Secretary. We've pointed out that charter flights, general aviation, cargo, these are still significant gaps in security, and they in fact have to be addressed. It's a matter of priorities and funding. Almost any aircraft can be a weapon. We saw in the Florida case where just a general aviation aircraft was stolen and flown into a building. That could have very well been an aircraft that had some chemical biological agents on it as well. And the point is the threats and the vulnerabilities are everywhere.
Yeah, but this one is so obvious. I mean, what's taking so long? Here we are a long time after 9/11, and, it's nothing's being done, I can assure you, because I use these planes fairly frequently, and I've never seen a touch of security.
It's recognized, and it's, we keep pointing it out, but we can't make them do it. Hopefully, the commission will point this out as well as one of the gaps, and that is a gap that needs to be addressed.
I would say it's a fairly urgent and glaring one, considering the urgency that's been applied to some other sectors. This is, well, anyway, enough said. The other question I have is, as a veteran of the Reagan administration, I participated in a major crisis effort to increase airline security after several hijackings in the early days of the Reagan administration. And I recall that a U.S. Marshal program was put into effect at that time with great urgency. And I also recall that there was an edict put out to put reinforced doors and to see that the doors were kept closed throughout the flight with only the pilot having the key. Whatever happened to those programs?
Well, unfortunately, the history has been when the particular event leaves the headlines, the follow-through has not always been what we would want it to be. And that's the case with many of the recommendations that took place after 103, after TWA 800. We have 9/11, and we have a situation where the Federal Air Marshal Service went from about 30 or less than 100 to several thousand within a short period of time. We have a situation where the recommendation that you made early on about cockpit doors being locked and so forth, that now, some 10, 15 years later, we now have, as a result of 9/11, we have 80% of the fleet with doors installed, and the deadline being at the end of the week for all of the fleet. It's sort of the nature of where we've been is as long as there is oversight and constant reinforcement that these things must be done, the more likely that they will in fact be done.
Commissioner Feely?
Thank you. I have two quick questions to you, Mr. Dillingham. But first of all, I guess as a cranky flyer, I ought to tell you that I think the TSA people are a vast improvement, and they're obviously trained in attitude as well, and I applaud you for that. You gave us the list of priorities, of vulnerability priorities, and I understand air and then maritime. But for our planning purposes, could you go a little further down the list?
I think the next one on the list would be mass transit. Freight rail would follow that. Mm-hmm. And it's the reason I say mass transit is because so many persons use mass transit, and an incident on mass transit would have not only disastrous human effects, but the psychology of that would also be tremendous. Rail, it's hard to prioritize them too much because a chemical biological accident associated with rail has both the human dimension as well as the psychological dimension. So it's in that order I would go: aviation, maritime, mass transit, rail. Okay. Now, having said that, more people ride the bus than many of these modes combined, but it's the incident. The likelihood that you're going to do damage to enough buses at one point in time, as opposed to what would happen in mass transit, as we saw in the Japan incident, it's different. So it's the greatest harm to the greatest number of people is part of the decision about where things rank.
Okay, thank you. And the other thing is just to follow up on what Secretary Lehman asked you. Your answer to the light aircraft issue, which has boggled everybody's mind who's ever been around one of those, is you can't make them do it. Who's them?
Well, you can make recommendations, and usually our recommendations will go to the U.S. Congress, and we make recommendations to the agencies who in turn are responsive to the U.S. Congress. So it has to be a congressional priority that's followed through, and oftentimes, I think someone mentioned today that action goes where the money goes. So it's not for us to sort of make policy, it's for us to present the information to the policymakers, and from there, they can make them do it.
But how about the executive branch?
Those are the people that we generally are saying need to do something. I mean, we are a congressional agency, and our mission is oversight generally of the executive agencies. And I don't want to sound like they don't do anything, but generally the implementation is not the way we would want it to be. There's some of the recommendations that have been made about aviation have been around for years. They were, either not implemented or partially implemented, And after 9/11, there was a new urgency to it. But, we've been talking about screeners not doing what they're supposed to do for 15 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Last question from Commissioner Roma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to join in applauding the help that this particular panel has been to the Commission. I want to ask Mr. Fine, having been on the Education Committee for 12 years in Congress and having sat through many oversight hearings of SEVA and heard time and time and time again that we couldn't implement the program. It'd be another year, it'd be another year. We were experiencing this problem and that problem. When is this finally going to be ready to be fully implemented and working in our country?
Well, it has been implemented. There is the SEVA system available. It applies to new students now. There are clearly bugs in it. There are clearly problems with it. But I believe the INS has made significant progress in implementing the system, and we've pointed out where the deficiencies are. They need to address those deficiencies. Come August, they say that it will apply to every student, not solely the new students, but also the continuing students. So according to their schedule, by August of this year, the SEVA system will be up, running, available, and we hope will be adequately followed through with all the things that need to be done to ensure that it's fully implemented as well.
You have confidence that that deadline is going to be reached?
I wouldn't say with confidence it's going to be reached, because I've seen similar things that you've seen. What we will say is that they've made progress and they need to make more progress.
Mr. Woldsky, one quick question for you. With respect to Saudi Arabia and the efforts that they are making internally and bilaterally with the United States to do more about cracking down on the financing of contributions to terrorist operations, how would you measure the lack of progress since 9/11 internally? What have they done internally to crack down? And secondly, externally and bilaterally with the United States, in addition to elevating this to the highest levels of concern for us, what other steps need to be taken to make this communication more of a priority in terms of benchmarks and implementing programs?
Sure. Well, in assessing what has been done, I think it's helpful to distinguish again between tactical measures and strategic measures. The tactical measures are, again, ones that target particular nodes of the terrorist financing infrastructure, particular individuals, particular charities, et cetera. And much of that activity is conducted by law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Much of it is not transparent and should remain not transparent. And there has been a substantial amount of activity, as I understand it, between the United States government and the Saudi government at the tactical law enforcement and intelligence level. At the same time, there have been indications that there are problems, chiefly with respect to the two public designations that were made of organizations or individuals that support terror. Jointly, I mean joint designations under the IEPA statute with the Saudi government. There were two last year. One was targeting the Al Harman charity, and the other was targeting an individual who was identified by the Treasury Department as a significant contributor. One of the co-founders of Al-Qaeda is what I believe the Treasury press release says. Now, with respect to Al Harman, the problems are published reports that it's still in business. With respect to the individual who was identified in September and designated by the U.S. government, the problem is that in the days after his designation by the U.S. government, the designation was questioned by senior Saudi officials. So that indicates to me, at least, that notwithstanding substantial efforts, there are still problems at the tactical level in identifying particular nodes within the terrorist financial system with Saudi Arabia. Now, at the strategic level, there you get into questions of regulation of charities, steps that are being taken or avoided with respect to putting in place know your customer rules and suspicious activity reporting requirements within Saudi financial institutions, regulations of charities, and hawalas, things of that sort. And again, that information should be publicly available. It should be available to this commission. It should be available to the United States government. It should be available to me as a concerned private citizen when I log on to the web. But at least in respect of my efforts, I haven't been able to find it.